It's a pleasure for us to introduce Tania Mitchell, our keynote for this afternoon and evening. And I can think of not a better person to address our group in terms of the focus of our work and the focus of your work, Tania, in terms of your life work. And we're in your backyard. And yesterday I had a chance, so Tania is Associate Professor of Higher Education in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. You can read more about Tania here. We're going to share a little bit just from our heart and from our perspective. And so first of all, I just want to share with you, last night I stayed over on the other side of the river, and I walked around the University of Minnesota, and I thought of you, and I walked by this golden gopher. And I took a picture of the golden gopher, sent it to my child, and was encouraging her to think about the University of Minnesota in terms of a place to go to school. Tania, when I think of you and your work, our paths crossed a little bit when we were both in California, and I think of your ability to be a scholar and a practitioner. Your roots are in doing the work and facilitating and connecting with communities, and your scholarship is in the theory of the work and how it connects all of us to our communities. Particularly, I think of our field, there's different voices and prophetic voices, and maybe it's wonderful that we're in a chapel setting, because I think of you as a prophet in our work in terms of your encouraging us to look at the truths that are in front of us, but that aren't always fully present because they're hidden in layers of things that sometimes we don't want to talk about. And so I'm very appreciative of your voice. And then I just also want to thank you. A couple years ago, we had a chance to be together at a convention in Colorado and had a chance to get to know each other better. And I appreciate the depth of who you are, and both as a scholar, practitioner, but also as a human being, parent, and person. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the things that I've been sharing today, and something that I think about often, is the idea of critical connections, right? That term in particular came across by an amazing feminist organizer by the name of Grace Lee Boggs. And so the way that I took it was, being able to build those intentional relationships, right? And so I think about that often when I think about Tania in particular. I first met Tania last year when she came to USF to do a workshop, and just the amount of impact that she had in the room was amazing and really, truly beautiful to witness to as well. Another thing that I'm sitting with is the idea of representation matters, right? So the idea that there's a Black woman here in the service learning field who is asking critical connections for us, or critical questions rather, for us to think about is truly, truly powerful. So thank you for all the work that you do, the way that you show up. I mean, these questions are already her questions that I'm excited to build more around. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Dr. Tania Mitchell to the stage.
That was an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you both very much. It is hard to then live up to something like that, so hope I don't disappoint. So I wanted to start with 3 questions that have been projecting as you came into the room, and I hope that you will take a moment to think about them, to reflect on them, to think about the possibility and resonance for yourselves, which is what I have been doing an awful lot in preparing to meet with you all today. Thank you for being here and for the opportunity to speak to you. To those of you who traveled to be here, I hope you enjoy your time in the Twin Cities. I'm now about to begin my 7th year here in Minneapolis, and it's the longest place I've lived anywhere in my adult life, which is wild. But it has also become a really important and powerful community for me, and so I am really grateful for the opportunity for you to experience it. For those of you who are here who consider the Twin Cities your home, thank you for being good hosts and neighbors. I really appreciate the work that it takes to welcome people into space and to do it well, and so I'm grateful to all of you who are taking part in that, both those of you who are convening and planning here at Augsburg, but also those of you from locally who are inviting people into your homes and into spaces that are familiar and important for you. I have referred to myself as a critical friend of service learning and community engagement for a while. I've chosen that label deliberately. I continue to embrace this practice that truly transformed my own educational experience, but also, to be really transparent, gave me a career, right? Look, hi, right? So I am lucky to have been shaped by this field. Simultaneously, it feels important and necessary for me to continue to challenge myself and our field to think about the ways that our practice and our communities could be transformed if we enacted ways to align our values with our practice. I am lucky to have a platform that affords me those opportunities as well. Those of you who are familiar with my work may know that I have long advocated for a more critical approach to service learning and community engagement, one that advances social justice concerns. I popularized the idea of critical service learning through articles published in 2007 and 2008, and a bunch more since then, but that's not important. But it's important for you to know that this idea was first coined by a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts named Cynthia Rosenberger in 2000. And she was building upon the work of a man named Robert Rhodes, a professor at UCLA who died this past year, who introduced us to critical community service in 1998. So my work definitely builds on theirs. And my work to operationalize critical service learning advances three key processes. The first is bringing attention to social change. The second, working to redistribute power. And finally, developing authentic relationships. I believe and advocate that when we center a community engagement project on with these three tenets in mind, our work in the community no longer substitutes generosity for justice. We may continue to do work that responds to immediate needs, but we also emphasize the limits of that work to redress inequality and seek actions that respond to systemic and structural injustice. When people ask me how or why I began to push for this social justice approach, I can't point to a particular moment in my own experiences, but several small moments that nag at me in my experiences. I think about the time that I was the only student of color at my placement site, even though almost everybody there looked a lot like me. I remember my feeling as an alternative break leader, that just feeling that we were woefully unprepared to enter a community that was 16 hours away from home. And the thought that we would contribute in a meaningful way was something that I just wasn't convinced by just yet. My own discomfort as a staff advisor to a student volunteer group that kept getting distracted by opportunities to plan free time instead of those learning and service opportunities that were supposed to be the focus of their work. My frustration as an instructor that our institution focused on community work that was imagined to be good learning opportunities for the students, regardless of whether it was the work that was most needed by the partners or that best responded to the social concerns underlying the agency's purpose. At the same time, I recall my sense of self as someone who believed a better world was possible and set out opportunities to do work that felt intentional in working towards that end. I remember being drawn to community service and volunteer opportunities as a space for learning more about people and communities I knew little about, and as an opportunity to respond, most often inadequately, to issues of injustice and inequality that I could name as wrong. As an activist, I imagined community engagement and service learning as a space on campus where I could do university-sanctioned activism, or at least do work and engage students in work that recognized injustice and sought out ways to address it. These recollections and desires still drive my commitment to a critical approach to our collective work, to a community engagement practice that is seeking social justice. Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang write about being, quote, born under the rising sign of social justice. It is a pull, or a pulse as they call it, towards values, ideas, and action that bring focus to your work. It is an idea that has resonated with me and that may also feel resonant for you and for your pull to a community-engaged practice. That is, work provides space where I can put my values into action so they feel like the commitments I want them to be. I hope that's true for you. Maybe you feel drawn to this space or this particular meeting with recognition that the expectations that you hope for your practice may not be fully realized because of barriers or limitations that feel outside of your control. I've certainly been there. More recently, I've been challenged by this opportunity to situate myself in oftentimes vibrant, critical, intellectual spaces to theorize community engagement, but lacking the space, the time, or relationships to move toward the praxis that I imagine. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today as a critical friend, imperfect, questioning, yet hopeful. And I'm still committed to the possibility of community engagement work as Nadine Cruz once defined it, as aligning our intention and action in a movement towards more just relationships. And I do think our intention towards social justice matters. A lot of my research in the field demonstrates that community engagement practice that clearly articulates a value of social justice yields outcomes that demonstrate commitments to reflective practice, engagements in careers focused on organizing and community development, and increased participation in political and community endeavors. Let me quickly share one study with you. Now, this study comes to us from CERU data. CERU is the student experience at the research university, which is an annual survey that's distributed to students at, quote, very high research universities. That's according to the Carnegie classification. There are 18 institutions, including the University of Minnesota, in the CERU consortium, and the survey offers an optional community engagement module that 7 campuses chose to implement in 2014, where this data comes from. In this particular survey, students are asked whether or not they've participated in a community engagement experience that year. If yes, they are asked to specify whether it's curricular or co-curricular. And students whose campuses have chosen the community engagement module are then prompted to respond to several other questions in that module. So again, 7 institutions responded to that module. Now, one of the items is asking students to characterize their community engagement work, and they are given a range of options you might think of as a spectrum from charity to justice. Hopefully you noticed right away that 51.7% of those students see their work as charity. 51.7% see their work as charity. You might also notice that less than 4% of those students characterize their work as social justice. This trend is troublesome because it continues to reflect a predominance in community engagement practice towards charity. Students were also asked to mark their engagement in a range of social change factors, both inside and outside the classroom. Essentially, they were asked how often they do these items that I'm projecting on the screen, including interacting with people with different views from their own, identifying possible solutions to a problem, or acting on concerns that they recognized in their community. Our analyses revealed that students who characterized their community engagement work as social justice were significantly more likely than their peers to participate in the 3 social change factors. But for that 52% of students who called their service charity, they were significantly more likely than their peers to report never participating in any of the social change factors, either inside or outside the classroom. So the way that students think about and characterize their service matters. It impacts significantly whether or not they are willing to engage in any of those factors that are considered important to developing a sense of social justice and becoming a reflective or reflexive community member. Now, one of the critiques of this research, of this instrument, and particularly of these particular questions, is that social justice goes undefined, right? Respondents, in this case undergraduate students, are left to their own understandings to determine how they classify their community engagement work, and we have no information about how they come to that decision or what informs their decision. We also don't know how the practitioners or instructors who guided their community engagement work described, defined, or presented the values underlying their work. Yet we know that a connection to those considerations matter. I see social justice as a catalyst, as an activator that challenges and inspires people towards the kind of practice that may actually respond to the anti-oppressive framework central to the values of the place-based justice network. I also recognize, however, the critique of the language of social justice as amorphous and unspecific, as code for almost every progressive idea, frankly, right? Tuck and Yang worry that too much of the ways social justice is put forward in scholarship, particularly in education and service learning and community engagement, is about, quote, getting communities, youth, children, and families caught up with white and middle-class people, as opposed to transformative work that seeks liberation. Social justice is also readily critiqued as becoming code or script for articulating a progressive worldview with minimal actions to truly define that commitment. A post on social media, a pin on your backpack, the right bumper sticker on your car, or sign on your office door becomes enough. The concern with this invocation of social justice is that it articulates values but not strategy. I may have a good sense of what you profess to believe about our society or community and what should change, but very little sense of how that translates into your day-to-day practice. And what does it mean for a field or a network to claim a value toward this aim if the strategies that might actually bring it forward are not evident? I'm a person who likes a good definition. And I feel like the solidity of a definition is helpful in being able to identify and enact strategies and actions responsive to our collective understanding of the term. But that's the hardest part about social justice. A collective understanding of the term eludes. It is often easier to think about social justice in terms of what it is not than in terms of what it will be once it's realized. Robin Kelley talks about social justice as freedom dreams, the impossible conditions of liberation that may be so bold that our imaginations cannot yet hold what could be. And yet our hope for that impossible condition, as Tuck and Yang term our desire for justice, and in turn the actions that we take to aspire toward it, can produce new possibilities and futures that can and should be significant for all of us. I've spent a lot of time researching how social justice has been defined and measured. In the measurement realm, most of the scales and tools are thinking about a bifurcated understanding of social justice in terms of attitudes and actions. They also tend to focus solely on interpersonal and intended actions. For example, I possess an ability to work with others in ways that are empowering. Agree, strongly disagree. Or I intend to talk with others about social power inequalities. Agree or disagree. And this is in opposition to a focus on structures of inequality or actions that seek systemic change. In thinking about social justice, I think it is helpful to look at theorizing. In reviewing theories of social justice, there are three paradigms that seem responsive to societal conditions and what would be required of society, its government and its members, to bring about more just conditions. And these are redistribution, recognition, and procedural paradigms of social justice theory. Social justice in the distributive paradigm works to rectify conditions of inequality by redressing and redistributing the material resources of and access to economic opportunity in a given society. Redistribution requires a centering of the economic concerns of injustice, usually at the expense of the other ways injustice manifests. While opportunities for economic wealth and participation are expanded, there are no controls for or attempts to rectify the other conditions whereby people experience injustice, i.e. structural violence, right? Redistribution assumes that providing financial means for life to all people will meet the demands of justice. Theorists in the recognition paradigm seek to acknowledge injustice outside of the dimension of class. Oftentimes, struggles for recognition are dismissed as identity politics or merely cultural, marking struggles whose experience of injustice does not hold its primacy in issues of material wealth as illegitimate or secondary. Recognition theories bring the dismantling of oppression as central to the concept of social justice, recognizing that injustice and oppression manifest in a number of ways that impact life economically, physically, and psychologically. The recognition paradigm requires actions that challenge both institutional structures and individual attitudes and actions in order to achieve social justice. Theories of procedural justice encourage us to look at the relationships between people to understand social justice. It is a reminder that indicators of social justice are not just assessed by who has or has not, but by the way people are treated and are concerned for the well-being of others. As Gilligan shares, relationship requires connection. A vision of social justice based in relationships requires members of that society to learn about and from one another in order to develop care, empathy, and concern. Procedural justice asks that we open ourselves up to the perspectives and experiences of others, that we work to make decisions cooperatively, and that we make those decisions with respect and concern for all people involved. I've come to believe that in order for social justice to be fully realized, according to Leanne Bell's definition as a, quote, society in which the distribution of resources is equitable and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure, where individuals are both self-determining, i.e. able to develop their full capacities, and interdependent, meaning capable of interacting democratically with others, end quote, we need to employ multiple theories of justice. Redistributive justice is necessary to change institutional structures that guard access to material resources. Recognition strategies must be employed to actively combat oppression and to radically transform our understanding of identity so that hierarchies of difference do not occur. And procedural justice is essential. Through fairness, cooperation, care, empathy, and understanding, relationships are developed and individuals and groups feel respected. Each of these paradigms intersect and overlap for social justice to be realized. The critical service learning approach views social justice through a lens that incorporates these three paradigms. Attention to social change as an element of critical service learning pedagogy encourages practitioners to organize service learning and community engagement experiences in ways that challenge the current distribution of material wealth and access to institutions, as well as to analyze those structures and make recommendations that might lead to redistribution. The recognition paradigm can also be seen in critical service learning's mandate to question the distribution of power. Iris Marion Young emphasizes access to power and the experiences of oppression as central to dismantling institutional structures that perpetuate injustice. A critical service learning approach asks that students analyze their own power and privilege and seeks to reconfigure service relationships in ways that do not maintain the hierarchies that create a cycle of dependence. Finally, developing authentic relationships through critical service learning experiences mirrors procedural justice. The procedural paradigm affirms that how people are treated, the process, is also important in bringing society closer to justice. The collaborative relationships, as well as the care and connectedness of service relationships, are essential to avoid the paternalism present in some community engagement experiences. My aim in introducing these ideas a little more than a decade ago was to offer a roadmap that might guide my practice and others who saw a connection to social justice as critical to their own work in community engagement. I think, or I like to believe, it has been informative and influential in changing conversations in classes and community engagement centers on campuses. But I think it's been less so in influencing our work in communities. That's what really excites me about your network. The Place-Based Justice Network has centered an anti-oppressive framework in its values, and I see this anti-oppressive frame as embedded within and perhaps inherent to a critical service learning approach, and certainly in an approach to community engagement that seeks social justice. Sakamoto and Penter name the, quote, eradication of oppression through institutional and societal changes as the ultimate goal in an anti-oppressive framework. And in 2012, Hines worked to outline 3 considerations of an anti-oppressive practice. She said, 1, that an anti-oppressive practice considers identity as multiple and fluid, recognizing that individuals are complex and multifaceted. 2, that power is not always exercised in a uniform way by one dominant group, but rather is created and recreated in social interactions and other relations between individuals, groups, and institutions. And 3, that focusing exclusively on working with individuals or groups ignores social structures and socio-political and structural problems. This first consideration of identity as multiple and fluid invokes another value of this network, that of intersectionality. Intersectionality creates the opportunity to respond to the multiple and interconnecting ways in which social concerns present themselves. You see, intersectionality, a term first coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, is at its core a recognition that injustice and oppression do not operate in a single axis of identity, but rather through all of them, simultaneously and differently, in an interlocking system of hierarchy and power. Community engagement projects too often fail to recognize the intersectional, the multiple, interconnected, and compounding societal aspects shaping the concerns highlighted and targeted through these efforts. Our field too often views social problems along that single axis of identity. Homelessness is merely an issue of class, educational equity, one of race, and immigration is solely an issue of citizenship, neglecting to address how matters of sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, marital status, and religious affiliation may also shape one's experiences with those challenges. Intersectionality has complicated our understanding of identity, marginalization, inequality, and power by recognizing the complexity of lived experience. Intersectionality emphasizes that identity, when viewed as singular and discrete, provides an incomplete picture that limits our ability to effectively work for and create change. Though Crenshaw introduced the concept of intersectionality in 1991, it has gained popularity in recent years. Dr. Crenshaw has expressed concern that her legal theory is being misappropriated in today's social movements. She stresses the urgency of intersectionality in a 2016 TED Talk, where she demonstrates the public's knowledge of the number of Black men and boys lost to police violence, against our ignorance of similar numbers of Black women and girls who have died due to violent police action. Her point: our failure to recognize the intersectional nature of social concerns renders people invisible. In particular, Crenshaw names, without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movement, left to suffer in virtual isolation. An intersectional approach to community engagement builds those frames to reveal how different groups are impacted, differently yet simultaneously, by social concerns, and hopefully mixes and pours the cement to fill those cracks. It builds what Andrea Karastasis calls radical alliances, spaces of difference, confrontation, spaces of risk, but also spaces committed to creating new possibilities and more just realities for themselves, for each other, and for our collective work. One of the common misperceptions of intersectionality is that it is only about identity. To say that I'm intersectional is to name my multiple marginalized identities to demand that you recognize my whole person, or to say that in our movement or in our work, we aim to include everyone who might share in our marginalization. In this way, intersectionality is used as a tool for inclusion, a tool to embrace diversity or to foster individual inclusion. But this is only one process of intersectionality. The strategy of intersectionality, as Crenshaw envisioned, is not only a tool for inclusion, it is a tool for analysis, to better understand the ways that social concerns manifest and oppress. Most importantly, it is an organizing strategy for social change. Wajasenge and Jones, in their work to articulate intersectionality as a strategy, build on prior work by Dill and Zambrano to arrive at three tenets: unveiling power, recognizing interconnected structures of inequality, and promoting social justice. Wajasenge and Jones view unveiling power in terms of deep self-reflection, the personal work important to understanding your positionality and power as it operates in your own life, but it is also important to think about unveiling power as a recognition and a revealing. We unveil power by acknowledging the hierarchy present in service relationships. We unveil power by looking at the institutional systems and structures that undergird the social concerns often addressed in service relationships. Unveiling power helps us to identify new spaces and possibilities for community work. As intersectionality, through a process of unveiling power, helps us to understand the complexity of social concerns, it also creates opportunities to recast power across multiple lines of identity to contest the social hierarchies often found in service relationships. To recognize interconnected structures of inequality is to recognize the ways, quote, systems of oppression, namely racism, classism, sexism, and heterosexism, work together to create a set of social conditions that place people, especially those holding multiple marginalized identity, in ever-present social jeopardy. A community engagement strategy informed by intersectionality reveals the ways that social concerns are indicative of interconnected structures of inequality. Such an intersectional community engagement approach is intentional in exploring social concerns through multiple dimensions of identity to ensure that the problem is more fully understood. We can no longer see housing insecurity as merely an issue of class, but must interrogate how different populations in our communities experience housing insecurity because of rules and policies that don't allow women without children to access emergency shelters, or don't provide safe shower or restroom options for people who are gender diverse, or require a photo ID to access services. Faith-based temporary housing options that require participation in religious services in order to maintain your bed, or the pervasiveness of LGBTQ youth being kicked out of their parent or guardian's homes when they open up about their sexuality. When we do this work, it requires us to be honest about the choices for our work in and with community, that we are straightforward about the possibilities and the limitations of that service to influence the communities impacted and the communities that we render invisible by choosing certain types of partnerships over other work. It is a recognition that work to respond to these different experiences of housing insecurity by different groups likely requires more than serving meals at the soup kitchen. Wajasinge and Jones asserted that, quote, increased recognition of the connection between personal identities and social systems that either support or confront oppression is an essential component in engaging people in social justice work. And promoting social justice is that third tenet of intersectionality as a strategy for social change. Promoting social justice places our work in a space of moral imagination, of visioning new possibilities, in a space of advocacy, voicing concerns for the ways things are, and a space of action, taking steps in solidarity with others to effect meaningful and sustainable change on the social concerns that impact our communities. Intersectionality, Crenshaw contends, requires us to, quote, sustain a vision of social justice that recognizes the ways racism, sexism, and other inequalities work together to undermine us all. So these connections between social justice, intersectionality, and an anti-oppressive framework are natural, but also imperative for our work to be what we want and need it to be. As a reminder of Heinz's three considerations of anti-oppressive practice, identity, power, and attention to the structural nature of social concerns are important. These considerations suggest, and a critical service learning pedagogy concurs, that understanding identity and the way that structural conditions impact people who hold different identities differently is essential to advancing action to eradicate oppression. That understanding how power operates and taking active steps to reconfigure power is needed and imperative to bring about more just conditions. That exclusive attention on interpersonal interactions and engagement opportunities that are transactional will never accomplish the aims of an anti-oppressive framework, and therefore limit the possibilities for achieving social justice. As we began, I offered three questions to consider. The first, what does this work care about? Second, is commitment to an anti-oppressive practice a value or a strategy? And if we want it to be a strategy, what are the actions that represent that practice? And finally, Who do I want to be in a movement for social justice? And is my work in community engagement the way that I want to partake? My reflections on these questions are always evolving, and I'm coming to not necessarily think about that as a bad thing. My responses to the first two questions depend on if I'm answering for myself or for who I believe this field to be in the moment. It's also sometimes dependent on the spaces that I'm in and the people I'm sharing those spaces with. It drives the level of confidence and comfort I feel in expressing an explicitly political stance on this work that our institutions are sometimes loath for us to take. When I'm less hopeful, I worry that our work relies too much on the good work of too few people to truly sustain the movement needed to create social change. I fear that the popularity of community engagement strategies as good PR limits the ability to be intentional, strategic, thorough, and thoughtful about the partnerships we develop and the work we do through those collaborations. I doubt that social justice is a possibility or sometimes even a desire in our practice. But if this work isn't ultimately about that, I'm not sure what we care about at all. In my most optimistic moments, I know this work cares about equity and inclusion. I know this work cares about inspiring people to make connections and links that will guide their futures toward work, relationship, and community building that advances social justice. That we care about the concerns and the conditions that limit the life chances and opportunities of too many people in our society. And that we want to do the kinds of work that calls out that reality, that insists that awareness is necessary and action is imperative, that our work builds the kinds of communities that break down barriers, expand opportunities, and seek liberation, that being in community with others is important for the connection, joy, and empowerment that results from being in relationship. I know that our work creates space and opportunity to imagine new futures and possibilities, and that these efforts allow us to be co-theorists of social justice. For those born under the rising sign of social justice, according to Tuck and Yang, quote, "The impulse to dream and work toward justice may feel like it was part of your being since before your birth. It may have shaped and continues to shape your education, influences your relationships, inspires your work and your decisions on almost every level. My hope is that you always have the courage necessary to act on your convictions, that you find allies and accomplices to support you in the journey, and that our collective work leads to those freedom dreams of liberation." Thank you.